So, good evening, everyone. My name is Mervyn Russell, and I'm a retired member of the Order of Ministry in the United Church of Canada, and also a continuing member on the roll of the British Methodist Church, in which I was trained. And I'm presently attend St. John's United Church in Oakville. But before we go any further, I'm going to recognize the land on which I am at least am located. I recognize that I and many others on this webinar are living on the lands and the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that these lands at various times have been inhabited by the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We acknowledge that all the prosperity of our settler society is based on the resources that were used by these first inhabitants of North America, and which the settler society has then claimed as their own. We commit ourselves to pray and act to develop respect, knowledge, justice, and reconciliation between our two peoples. So this evening's program is the last of a series of 3 illustrated presentations given by retired Professor Dan Epp-Tiessen of the Central Mennonite University in Winnipeg. And I'll introduce Dana a little later. As Dan has done in the previous 2 presentations, he'll give a 40-minute illustrated talk, and Dan is quite willing to respond to questions or comments as he goes through his presentation. And if you want to do that, please use the raised hand function, which you'll find associated with the reaction box, which is in the middle of the bottom of your screen. Or, of course, you can put a comment or question into the chat, and that will be kept an eye on by Cindy McQuaig, who's our technical host for this evening. And whether you're going to say something verbally or whether you're going to write in the chat, please be concise and, of course, polite. The role of Christian Zionism in the founding and development of the State of Israel is an important thing to consider, both from the point of view of the past and the point of view of the present. And for members of Christian communities, it's important that they should know that history and decide for themselves whether it's what I call commendable or reprehensible. And Professor Dan will help us to understand what these issues have been and still are. So I'm now going to read a short piece that Professor Dan provided about himself. He's retired from teaching teaching Bible and theology at the Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg for 26 years. He's grateful for the ongoing opportunities in congregations and in the community to live out his vocation of teaching and preaching the Bible and Christian faith, especially without assignments to mark in the evening. So Dan is a member of the Mennonite Church Manitoba Palestine Israel Network and is in active solidarity efforts to resist Israel's settler colonial oppression of Palestinians and its genocide in Gaza. Dan enjoys gardening, bird watching, camping, biking, exercising, reading, and spending time with his wife Esther, as well as their children and grandchildren. Dan is an active member of Home Street Mennonite Church in Winnipeg, where he finds spiritual nurture, deep Christian fellowship, and opportunities to serve. So, with that introduction, Dan, we're over to you for this third presentation.
Well, thanks, Mervyn, and thanks to all of you for being here again this evening. So, how did we get from the Bible to genocide in Gaza? And we've been looking at three different tracts. One track, the Bible's land promises, and how those land promises have played a significant role in creating Israel's settler colonialism and its dispossession of Palestinians, which led to resistance by Palestinians, including Hamas, and Hamas's resistance led to Israel's genocidal actions in Gaza. And then last week we looked at how the sort of history of Christian anti-Semitism used New Testament texts to build an anti-Semitic theology, and that Christian anti-Semitism was a major factor in creating the Jewish Zionist movement, which sought to create the state of Israel as a Jewish state that would always be a safe refuge for Jewish people persecuted because of anti-Semitism. Today, Christian Zionism and how which biblical texts it focuses on, and how it uses the Bible, and how Christian Zionism has played a significant role in bringing about the genocide in Gaza. Okay, so first of all, I'll begin with begin by sharing my screen here. A definition of Christian Zionism. Um, the belief that Christians should support the state of Israel because Israel plays an important role in God's plans for the world. Now, there's somewhat different types of Christian Zionism depending on the rationale, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Um, so I'm going to start with two bold claims. So, if it had not been for British Christian Zionists, the Jewish Zionist movement would probably never have succeeded in establishing the modern state of Israel. And then the other claim is that without the huge influence and massive political clout of American Christian Zionism, the U.S. would not be providing billions of dollars of economic and military aid to the state of Israel every year. And in the case of the genocide in Gaza, Israel dropped so many bombs on Gaza right from the get-go that Israel very quickly ran out of bombs and missiles. And Joe Biden then was happy to provide Israel with all that it needed, and of course that has continued under Donald Trump. So the U.S. is the enabler of Israel's genocide in Gaza, and one of the reasons it is the enabler is because of the impact of Christian Zionism on U.S. Politics. Okay, as I said, there are somewhat different types of Christian Zionism depending on sort of the rationale. One is humanitarian. So this was particularly common after World War II. Mainline theologians became aware of the long history of Christian anti-Semitism and how it culminated in the Holocaust. So these Christian theologians argued that Jewish people deserved, needed their own nation state to keep them safe. As I said, this was a common position among mainline theologians after World War II. Not so much anymore, because most theologians have seen that the Jewish Zionist movement has led to the dispossession of Palestinians, has led to massive injustice, and so nowadays this type of Christian Zionism is not found very often. The other two, though, the formation of the modern state of Israel fulfills biblical prophecy, and therefore it represents God's will. Therefore, Christians should support the modern state of Israel. And then the formation of the state of Israel is the first stage or step in setting in motion this whole chain of events leading to the return of Jesus and the end times. Okay, so Christian Zionism makes use of four different types of biblical passages. So, the land promises that we've already talked about. So God promises to give the land of Canaan to Abraham, Sarah, and their descendants, the Israelites, forever. And Christian Zionists say that forever means forever, and that these promises are still in effect. Therefore, the modern descendants of Abraham and Sarah have a right to the land of Palestine, and Palestinians do not have a right to that land. Secondly, there are the stories of Israel's miraculous conquest of Canaan and subsequent ethnic cleansing that we read about in the book of Joshua. And that creates a kind of vision and imagination of how God works in the world and of how God's people should act in the world. And if it was okay for God's people back in biblical times to commit genocide and steal the land from the Canaanites, then it's part of God's will for the modern Jewish people to take the land from the modern Canaanites, i.e., the Palestinians. Thirdly, then prophetic promises. So the Babylonian exile, when Babylon destroyed the state of Judah in the year 586, 87, that was a huge, huge crisis. The Babylonians, I mean, first of all, the massive amounts of killing, terrorizing. The city of Jerusalem was leveled, temple was destroyed, the king was taken into exile. And this was a huge, well, physical crisis, but also a theological, spiritual crisis. Has God forgotten us? What about our whole story of our covenant with God and so forth? Is any of that still true? The Old Testament prophets answer that question by saying, God has not forgotten us. That the covenant is still, or there will be a new covenant, or the old covenant will be revived, and someday there will be a time of restoration. God will gather the exiles who've been taken to Babylon and who have fled elsewhere, bring them back to the land of Canaan, and create for them a powerful Jewish state. So, after the Babylonian exile, there was some restoration of the state of Judah, but it was just a small community gathered around Jerusalem. And so, in a sense, those prophetic promises have sort of stayed there, pretty much unfulfilled. Okay. And Christian Zionist says that the modern state of Israel fulfills those promises, those prophecies. Okay, and then fourthly, and this is somewhat of a newer argument, and it's the self-interest argument, based on Genesis 12, verse 3, where God calls Abraham, and God's Genesis 1 to 11 highlight the problem of human sin and brokenness. And then in chapter 3, it begins the story of how God begins to create the chosen people as a response to the problem of human sin and brokenness. God will call forth, create a people who will receive the gift of God's salvation and knowledge about how to live faithfully, and they will be a people through whom God wants to bless and offer salvation to all of humanity. Hence, through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed, God says to Abraham. And then God says that those peoples who bless you, they will be blessed, but those who curse you, curse Abraham, Israel, will be cursed. So this passage is sometimes used by American Christian Zionists to say this is why the U.S. must always support the state of Israel. It's in our own self-interest. Because if we look out for the state of Israel, then we as a nation state will be blessed. Okay, so Um, I am not familiar with the early origins of Christian Zionism, but I know that somewhere in the 1700s, Protestant theologians, pastors began to argue that those promises of return to the land and restoration of a Jewish state that we find in the biblical prophets, those passages have not yet been fulfilled. And all prophecy must be fulfilled. And so these promises will be fulfilled and soon. And so these pastors, theologians argued that Jewish people will be returning to the land of Palestine to create a Jewish state. So that's the beginning of Christian Zionism in the 1700s. So ironically, Christian Zionism precedes Jewish Zionism by a good 150 years. But Christian Zionism then gets a major boost by this cheery looking fellow, John Nelson Darby. He was a priest in the Church of England, became disillusioned because the church wasn't spiritual or evangelical enough or biblical enough. And he and some others, they formed an evangelical Jew group that eventually broke off from the Church of England and became the Plymouth Brethren, which is still an evangelical Christian group today. Okay, Darby was also preoccupied by the Bible's eschatological passages, these biblical passages that talk about the coming of God's good future, the kind that we call the end times passages. And the world would be a whole lot better off if he'd have just done more pastoral care and visited more sick people, rather than spend endless amounts of time reading all these Bible end times passages. And so what he did is that he took passages from the book of Ezekiel and from Daniel and Zechariah and from the Gospels and from Paul and the book of Revelation and threw all these passages into a big blender, and out came the end time scheme that is still being preached. If you watch late night cable TV on Sunday nights, you'll find all kinds of preachers preaching exactly this, or pretty much this end time scheme that Darby invented in the early 1800s. And you get these all kinds of different charts. It gets really complex. I'm not going to try to explain all this. But Darby's scheme, it's this scheme of, there will be all these signs, and then all these signs pointing to the rise of the Antichrist, and there will be the rapture. Darby invented this idea of the rapture. And then the Antichrist will take world control of the world through the United. Well, he didn't. Anyway, and then there's a 7 year period of tribulation. Da 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 da. All that stuff. Darby was the one who came up with that scheme. And Darby, he was very energetic. He traveled endlessly to promote his understanding of Scripture and these end times passages. He traveled to the United States several times. Um, and eventually, this end times scheme, it became very popular. And a key thing here is that the whole scheme, what sets it in motion is the return of Jewish people to the land of Palestine to create a Jewish state. That's what kicks off the whole sort of countdown to the end, and it fulfills biblical prophecy. So Darby begins to promote the scheme broadly in Europe, especially England, and in America. And eventually, this scheme it becomes deeply, deeply entrenched in evangelical Christianity. In the United States, it's promoted, taught through a whole network of Bible schools, tracts, publications, magazines, prophecy conferences, and then later radio preachers, then TV, now the internet. Some of you may remember in the 1970s Hal Lindsey's book, Late Great Planet Earth. And then in the 1990s, there were the Left Behind novels that promoted this scheme, and they sold something like 85 million copies. It was a massive, profitable publicity publication project. Okay, anyway, so uh, this becomes very significant for Palestine because after a while, there are British politicians like this man, Lord Shaftesbury, who become convinced of this end time scheme. And so these end time schemes and the belief that Jewish people will soon be returning to Palestine to create a Jewish state there, this belief begins to have concrete political implications. So, Lord Shaftesbury is a British politician. You see that mid 1800s there and late 1800s. Britain presides over a massive world empire at this time. Now, a bit of background here. Okay, for 600 years, Palestine, the red arrow there points to Palestine. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, this green area. The Ottoman Empire lasted for centuries and centuries. It was based in Turkey, which is located just north of, uh, of that red arrow. So, during Lord Shaftesbury's time, the Ottoman Empire is beginning to weaken and show cracks. And France and Britain are hovering like vultures, just waiting to pick off any parts of the Ottoman Empire that they can get their hands on, because this is still the great imperial age, and they're each still trying to expand their empires. So for Lord Shaftesbury, Zionism was just a great opportunity. Number one, it was an opportunity to extend the reach of the British Empire and keep the French out of the Middle East. In other words, if England would promote and support the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine, the Jewish people would be very, very grateful to Britain, and they would promote British interests in the Middle East. Secondly, this was an opportunity to address Europe's and Britain's Jewish problem. You see, Lord Shaftesbury was an anti-Semite, and creating a Jewish state in Palestine was a good strategy for getting the Jews out of Europe and out of England. And thirdly, you could do all of this while fulfilling biblical prophecy. And isn't life wonderful when all of these different sort of goals come together? So, Lord Shaftesbury, he represents a significant development because after him, there are always British politicians who are Christian Zionists and who are promoting the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. So Shaftesbury, he begins to lobby the British government to take concrete steps. He sends out agents to survey Palestine in preparation for Jewish settlement and immigration. Okay, uh, just shortly after Shaftesbury's time is when the Jewish Zionist movement begins, led by Theodor Herzl. And we've talked about him, I think it was two sessions ago. Herzl didn't create the idea of Jewish Zionism. There were a number of different people who came up with the idea of Zionism separately. And remember, Zionism is the movement to encourage European Jews to move to Palestine, settle Palestine in large numbers in order to create a Jewish state there, especially to create a refuge there for Jewish people who are victims of anti-Semitism. So, Herzl travels broadly, lobbies European politicians, raises funds, speaks to Jewish groups to try and get them on board. He visits the head of the Ottoman Empire to lobby the Ottoman Empire to let Jewish people start settling in Palestine, and they tell him to get lost, of course. Um, but he was energetic, and he got the movement going. And I think I showed these slides 2 weeks ago when I talked about how the Zionist movement uh, absorbed Europe's colonial racism from the get-go, right? The whole European colonial empire was undergirded by a deep, deep racism that white Europeans were more civilized, more valuable than the barbaric indigenous people, uncivilized barbaric indigenous peoples in the rest of the world. And that's why Europeans had the right to go anywhere in the world and conquer and take over the lands. The Zionists absorbed those racist colonial ideas, and you see it here in this statement where Herzl is very clear. Our goal is to expropriate all of the land in Palestine, and then we will push out the Palestinians into neighboring countries. Um, uh, Oh, sorry, that was I was talking about the wrong quote. This is the quote where he's expressing the idea that the European Jews will bring civilization, cleanliness, and order to the plague-ridden, blighted corner of the Orient. And here's where he talks about expelling Palestinians. Okay, this interesting man, William Hechler, Anglican priest and energetic Zionist. He took the initiative to seek out Herzl and say, "What can I do to help you?" Because he was so convinced that Christians must support the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine in order to fulfill biblical prophecy. Hechler had high connections, and so he used those connections to introduce Herzl to various European political leaders. So he's just one example of how the Christian Zionists helped the Jewish Zionists. Okay, I said earlier that after Lord Shaftesbury, there were always British politicians who were Christian Zionists eager to promote that cause. Um, that becomes critically important after World War II. Because by 1914, roughly the beginning of, sorry, World War One, not World War Two, uh, roughly the beginning of World War One, the Ottoman Empire has shrunk greatly. And this is the area that it still controls. During World War One, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany, and we know who lost and who won World War One. Britain used the excuse of World War One to invade the Middle East, and it Britain conquered Jordan and Palestine. And then after the war, the Ottoman Empire totally collapsed. And as the imperial powers do, they divide up the spoils. So after World War One, Britain took Jordan and Palestine. France got Syria and Lebanon. Then Lord Balfour, he was the foreign secretary in the British government after World War One. He is a Christian Zionist. Foreign secretary, he's responsible for British foreign policy. He is a Christian Zionist, as was the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. Um, And this represents now a total game changer for what happens in Palestine. So, because Balfour and other British politicians are Christian Zionists, they use the political power of the British Empire to facilitate the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine. So in 1917, Balfour sends a letter to Lord Rothschild, who is a leader in the Jewish community in Britain. And this letter is what's called the Balfour Declaration. And it's a total game changer. Okay, so here you see that Balfour is speaking for the British government, which is sympathetic to the Jewish Zionist aspirations. So the British government is now going to get behind the Zionist cause, which is all about creating a Jewish state and ultimately displacing um, Palestinians. So here is the more important part of the Balfour Declaration, that the British government supports the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will do what it can to facilitate uh, achieving this objective. But it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which prejudices the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, empires often have very stupid foreign policies. Just look at the empire to the south of Canada, right? Uh, anyway, so the British foreign policy was, I mean, at least how it's stated here, we're going to support the Zionist cause, support the Jewish people returning to Palestine, to their national homeland, so to speak. But we don't want any harm to come to the local non-Jewish population in Palestine. Well, that's of course totally ridiculous, because if you're going to let the Jewish people immigrate to Palestine in large numbers and colonize the place, that's not going to impact the locals negatively. Of course it will. Of course it will. Um, One cannot overestimate the significance of the Balfour Declaration for what's been happening in Palestine ever since. And it was fascinating. I was in Palestine last November, uh, and it was surprising to me how often in conversations with Palestinians they would talk about the Balfour Declaration. So today, more than 100 years after the Balfour Declaration was issued, Palestinians know about it, and they know the impact that that declaration has had on them. How many Canadians know anything about any Canadian law from 100 years ago, right? Um, okay, so what happens? Oh, Balfour, right? Balfour is a thorough racist. And so he says, we don't want to harm, the existing population in Palestine. But he was very racist towards Palestinians. And so here a statement, in Palestine, we're not even going to go through the exercise of consulting the wishes of the Palestinians, because we and the other great powers, we are committed to Zionism. Right. And that's how empires, great powers work. They just do whatever they're going to do, pretty much regardless of the wishes of the locals. Mervyn, I see that you have your hand up.
Yeah, just an additional comment on people like Balfour and Lloyd George, and another very influential person in this whole development, Sir Mark Sykes, um, who was involved with Frenchmen by the name of Pico in dividing up this part of the land after the uh, destruction of the Turkish Empire. They all came from well, in the case of Balfour from Scotland, in the case of Lloyd George, and Sykes from Scotland, and from Lord George from Wales. Now, the significant part of that is that these were Calvinistic areas.
Mm,
They were not areas of the Church of England. Shaftesbury would have belonged to the Church of England. But Lloyd George, for example, said that he knew the names of the communities in Palestine from his church upbringing better than he knew the towns and cities in France. Um, and the those particular areas with that particular Calvinistic tradition pay far more attention to the Old Testament than in the majority of cases was true of the Church of England. So there's also a kind of churchmanship aspect to this development, and of course we mustn't forget that Palestine was important to these politicians because it guarded the gateway to India, and India was the jewel crown.
yeah, I mean, and that's why, like Lord Shaftesbury, um, if Britain gains influence in Palestine, it promotes the interests of the British Empire, and there were dreams of building a railroad from Europe to India. Um, Yeah, so there were all kinds of political interests at play, and you see, as Mervyn has pointed out, the sort of blending of Bible, Christian theology, and politics. And Christian Zionism is just a really good illustration of how bad theology leads to bad politics and leads to
That's
lots
true.
and lots of harm. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so what happens after the Balfour Declaration on the Jewish side, on the Zionist side? Sorry, Zionist side. Uh, Britain, because Britain now controls Palestine, it allows large-scale Jewish immigration. And Jewish people acquire more land. They create agricultural settlements, urban settlements. They start businesses, build schools, and they're very deliberately creating the infrastructure and institutions for the new Jewish state. Um, and from the very beginning, there is conflict with Palestinians, especially over land. And the Zionists know that their project will not succeed without violent conflict. So they start preparing for that and they start acquiring arms. Okay, on the Palestinian side, there's growing awareness of what the Zionists are up to. So the Palestinians feel like they are being invaded and their territory is being colonized and taken away from them. And from the very beginning, there is Palestinian resistance, especially from the grassroots. Not so much from the upper class, because what often happened is that some of the upper class were absentee landowners and they actually sold their land to the Zionists. The Zionists raised money around the world and they bought some of their land from absentee Arab Palestinian landowners, offered them good prices, and so they bought the land. Now, that land had always been farmed by tenant farmers. And previously, when land had been bought or sold, the tenant farmers always went with the land. But once the Zionists bought the land, the whole reason for buying the land was to get the Palestinians off of it. And so those tenant farmers would be kicked off of the land, even though their families had been living there for hundreds of years. And that's where the rub was, and that's where the violence started. Okay. There's spontaneous grassroots resistance, and then there's a major Palestinian revolt against the British in 1937 to 39, but the Palestinians aren't very well organized. They don't have very good weapons. Britain suppresses the revolt very harshly, and that that greatly weakens the Palestinian resistance. Because after this revolt, most of the Palestinian leaders have either been killed, or they are in prisons, or they have been exiled. And what also happens is that in order to suppress the revolt, the British armed Zionist militia groups, trained and armed Zionist militia groups to help them fight against the Palestinians. Okay, World War II comes along. Britain is fighting Germany in multiple places, North Africa, Europe. And so it doesn't want to tie up its troops in Palestine. And so it decides to try and placate the Palestinians to avoid further armed revolt. So Britain cuts back on Jewish immigration. But of course, this is exactly the time when large numbers of Jewish refugees are fleeing Europe because they want to get away from the Nazis. And the Zionists want to bring in large numbers of Jewish immigrants, and Britain puts a lid on that. Uh, and during and after World War II, the conflict between the Zionist settlers and the Palestinians escalates quite significantly. So the war ends. Um, And after the war ends, some of the Zionist forces turn against their old patrons because Britain has not allowed enough Jewish immigrants in, and because the Zionists feel that Britain is now standing in the way of their goals. And Britain becomes increasingly frustrated because the conflict, the violence between the Zionists and Palestinians is increasing, and Britain just can't keep the peace, and it just isn't worth it anymore to the interests of the British Empire. And of course, by World War II, the British Empire has uh, pretty much ended. Okay, then. In July 1946, the Irgun, I'm calling the Irgun a Zionist terrorist group. Uh, they were responsible for slaughtering Palestinians. Uh, the Irgun is often portrayed as a Jewish liberation group if you're a Zionist, or a Zionist liberation group if you're a Zionist supporter. But they blow up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And that's where the British administration and military have their headquarters. 91 people are killed, and Britain decides that's it. We're out of here. We don't want this hassle anymore. So Britain submits the future of Palestine to a vote of the newly formed United Nations. There had been various proposals before the United Nations for how to settle this conflict in Palestine, and how to partition Palestine between a Zionist state and Palestinian territories. So, in 1947, the United Nations votes to partition Palestine and to give the Zionist territory for a Jewish state. Uh, the United Nations can often act in very colonial ways. They didn't care what the wishes of Palestinians were, and they just attached Palestinian areas to the whole West Bank to Jordan, the Gaza Strip to Egypt. So Britain withdraws from Palestine, and Israel immediately declares that it is a state, and right away there's war between Israel and the Palestinians. Palestinians get a bit of assistance from the Jordanians, the Iraqis, Syrians, Egyptians, but not much. Um, And the Zionist forces are powerful, they're better organized, better equipped, and they push the Palestinian forces back. And then 1948-49, I forget, the United Nations brokers a truce. So some maps. On the far left, you see the situation in 1947. The white areas where Jewish Zionists are predominate, the green areas where Palestinians are the majority. So you see how small the territory is where Jewish people were in the majority. So no wonder the Palestinians resisted partitioning what they considered to be their homeland and making a good chunk of it into the Zionist state of Israel. Then the second map is this was the UN partition plan to give the white areas to the state of Israel, the green areas to either Jordan or Egypt. Um, I mean, you don't have to be a political expert to realize those white areas, that doesn't really look like a viable state, uh, the territory of a viable state. Um, and the third map then is where things ended up after the UN brokered a truce between the new state of Israel and Palestinians and neighboring states. And then the fourth map, the green areas were then conquered by Israel in 1967. And according to international law, when you conquer the territory of a neighbor, you're not supposed to hang on to it. You're supposed to return it. But of course, Israel has never done that. And because Israel is a settler colonial state, right? And settler colonial state, the goal is always to get the land. And so the West Bank, in the final map there, you can see how it has been colonized, settled by Israel, and Israel controls the West Bank and is filling it with more and more Jewish settlements. Okay, so I think I'm just going to stop here a little bit for some. That's the story of how the modern state of Israel would not have come into being had it not been for Christian Zionism and the support of the British Christian Zionists. And so, had it not been for the support of these British Christian Zionists, um, state of Israel would not have come into being. The Nakba would not have happened. The state of Israel would not have dispossessed 1 million Palestinians of their land and their homes. Uh, Hamas would never have come into being. And, you know, October 7th, the subsequent genocide would never have happened. Okay, we'll just take some time there now for questions, conversation, and then I'll talk about okay American Christian Zionism and its impact. So, any uh, thoughts, reflections, or questions? Yeah, Joan, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. This is very interesting and complicated, lots of history. I have a question though, because the Bible does believe that Christ is coming back, correct? And there will be a rapture. And I understand about the end time. I'm not following that, but I'm aware of Hal Lindsey in the past of various and American end time prophecy things. But the Bible does talk in Revelation, I forget where, but Christ is coming back. And I know in New Brunswick, I was told by my relatives that all the graves face east because Christ is supposed to come back in the east. So that's the tradition in the cemetery. So you still believe that, though, that Christ is going to come back and set up a new kingdom.
Right. I mean, the New Testament is full of expectation that that Jesus will return to earth
Yeah.
to finish the job he started at his first coming.
Yeah.
During Jesus' first coming to earth, he
Mm.
inaugurated the reign of God, the kingdom of God on earth. Um, but the earth is not yet the kingdom of God fully. So the New Testament has this deep, deep hope that someday Jesus will return to fully establish God's reign on earth. But the return of Jesus in the New Testament has nothing to do with the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel.
Interesting. That's I did not
Yeah,
I don't know all this, but I know a lot about history. So that's thank
yeah,
you for saying that. I
yeah.
didn't know.
That what's so remarkable is that during the time of Jesus, land was a big deal because Palestine was ruled by the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was very politically, militarily oppressive. And Jewish people deeply, deeply longed to throw off the yoke of the Roman Empire so that they could be an independent state. And so in the year 70, there was a major revolt against the Romans, and it led to the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. In year 135, there was another major Jewish revolt against the Romans. Those revolts were driven by the desire to get rid of these oppressive Romans and create an independent Jewish state. So these hopes are deeply, deeply alive.
Yeah,
Uh, the New Testament never mentions them once.
that's interesting.
It's not part of the New Testament picture. And I'll say more about the New Testament a little bit later. But
Okay, and just very briefly then, that's very interesting that, sorry, I'm trying to summarize it. You've gone through the whole history of where Christian Zionism started, and I knew that the US was backing Israel even to this day, but I did not understand the connections. So that's very interesting, a lot to think about. Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, Mervin, go ahead. You're muted, Mervin.
Well, worth mentioning that the leaders of the Jewish terrorist groups, as I believe you rightly called them, the Haganah, the Ergan, and the Palmach. I mean, Ergan was led by Begin,
Menachem Begin, who became
Menachem
prime
Begin,
minister later. Yeah.
who became prime minister later. And the Palmach, which was a breakoff, it was also called the Stern Gang, was a breakoff from Ergan, and that was led by Shamir, who later became prime minister of Israel. So it's very, very interesting how that um, after the Second World War, and the collapse of the British Empire, as you call it. The new power center in the world was the United States,
Mhm.
uh, and they were quite prepared to have dealings with these particular kinds of leaders, and the British really just had to kind of grin and bear it.
Mhm. Yeah. 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 Okay. I think that's a good segue to talking about American Christian Zionism. So, British Christian Zionism helped to create the mess in Palestine, and American Christian Zionism just perpetuates it and makes it even worse. Um, Okay, so on the U.S. front, immediately after 1948, interestingly, the U.S. support for the state of Israel was rather lukewarm. But that support has been growing ever since, and it's at an all-time high right now. Um, and of course, the genocide in Gaza has been committed almost entirely by American weapons that the U.S. has very, very willingly provided. So, why has the U.S. in the last decades become so totally supportive of the state of Israel so that Israel gets billions of dollars of American military economic aid every year, more than any other recipient of American foreign aid. Many factors go into something like this, but certainly one of those factors is American Christian Zionism. And just like British Christian Zionism impacted British politicians and had a significant impact on British political actions, uh, American Christian Zionism impacts American politicians and shapes American political actions. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here again. Uh, Okay, developments in American Christian Zionism. So, in the 20th century, Darby's end time scheme, it just grows enormously among American evangelicals, and it's propagated through a whole network of Bible schools, popular media, later radio, TV, books, sermons. Schofield Reference Bible is a Bible with footnotes based on this scheme. And the creation of the state of Israel is central to the scheme. So Christians must support the state of Israel because Christians should want Jesus to return. So, here, just to remind you of the major types of biblical texts that are the focus for Christian Zionism. Uh, Now, and part of what happens is that as the state of Israel comes into being, and then in 1967, there was what was called the Six-Day War, when Israel won a massive victory over its Arab neighbors in a short war in which it was greatly outnumbered. And to a lot of Christian Zionists, this seemed like God's intervention. And it looked like the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. All of these promises in the biblical prophets that the Jewish people would someday go back to their homeland and establish a powerful state. The biblical prophecy is being fulfilled before our very eyes. And so the developments on the ground lent a lot of credibility to Christian Zionist convictions. Um, okay, sorry, I lost my place in my notes here. Oh, right. Uh, Now, the the Christian end time scheme, Darby's end time scheme, it may seem a little bit wonky, um, but a couple of reasons why Christian Zionism became so popular is it seems to take the Bible so seriously. And, the Bible's land promises they're being fulfilled right before our eyes. Um, and then another reason is if you look at the Bible's end times passages, they are really complex, very difficult to understand. And you can't really correlate them with each other. And yet, so Darby's end time scheme, it seems to make sense out of these really difficult, complex biblical passages. And so that was partly why became so popular. Um, and in the last 50 years, American evangelical Christianity has become very politically active and very politically powerful in a way that it hadn't been earlier. And so American Christian Zionism then begins to have very significant political consequences And Christian Zionists begin to lobby U.S. politicians. And now, in the last few decades, woe to any U.S. politician who isn't a totally avid supporter of the state of Israel, because the Christian Zionists will immediately attack that politician. Barack Obama experienced some of that because he was somewhat critical of what Israel was doing. So Christian Zionism has become a massive political force in the United States. This man here, John Hagee, mega church pastor, he founded Christians United for Israel, claims to have 10 million members. He leads tours to Israel, raises funds for the state of Israel. When he visits the state of Israel, he will sometimes speak to the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament. He carries that much clout. And there are many, many other Christian preachers like him, just with not as much power. Um, and if you're ever feeling too happy and joyful and you want that joy kicked out of you, just Google John Hagee and listen to some of his sermons. They're just riddled with Christian Zionism and racism against Muslims and uh, yeah, some pretty ugly stuff. So, Christian Zionism now is this formidable political force. Now, I'm going to push back against Christian Zionism and offer some sort of anchor points for a critique. One of the great appeals of Christian Zionism is it sounds so biblical. But my argument is it actually is not biblical. It reads the Bible as if Jesus, Paul, and the New Testament never happened. Uh, Okay, so according to the New Testament, Jesus fulfills all of the Old Testament promises related to God's good future, including the land promises. That's why in the New Testament, neither Jesus nor Paul nor any other New Testament writer ever talks about the restoration of a Jewish state. That's no longer part of the agenda, because these land promises are fulfilled in Jesus. And that means they, in the Christian tradition, they don't have to be interpreted literally anymore. Let me just give you one illustration of that. There was a deep longing for an end to the Jewish exiles. The Jews would come home to the traditional land of Israel, and there to receive God's blessings. In in the New Testament, you come home by committing your life to Jesus. And that's how you receive the blessings of God. And this means that Jesus transposes these Old Testament promises, and they get what is sometimes called Christified. The old promises are reinterpreted in light of who Jesus is. Let me give you an example in a different area. If you look at the Old Testament passages that foretell the coming of a future Messiah, that Messiah is always a powerful king like David who's going to kick some serious enemy butt. Well, obviously, Jesus was not that kind of a Messiah. And so the Messiah passages get reinterpreted in the New Testament. That's also what happens to the land promises and other promises. And Jesus transposes the land promises into the kingdom or reign of God. And that means that the hope for the reestablishment of a powerful nation state, that drops off of the agenda. Uh, Jesus inaugurates God's kingdom here on earth, and that's God's great project to bring about healing, renewal for all of creation. Um, And so the agenda is, in the Old Testament, God's agenda is the formation of the Israelite people, and that's going to require some real estate. That's going to require a particular land to sustain them. In the New Testament, the focus becomes much bigger. The focus becomes universal. The establishment of God's kingdom in all of creation. And all of humanity, all the world's people are invited to become part of the renewed people of God. Paul, I want to talk a little bit about Paul and what he does with the land traditions, the land promises, and he Christifies them. And one of the ways he does that is how he uses the Abraham traditions. So Abraham, he is the first one to receive the promise of the land of Canaan. Okay, so so Abraham, very important figure in Jewish tradition, because he's the first one that God called. God called Abraham and Sarah, and from them created the Israelite people. So, what does Paul do with that Abraham tradition? Here he focuses on the blessing. Quoting Genesis 12, verse 3, Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, declared the Gospels, all the Gentiles shall be blessed in you. So, what's important about the Abraham tradition for Paul is not the land promises, but that through what God was starting in Abraham, God's goal was to bring blessing to all of humanity. And that goal has taken a significant leap forward through Jesus Christ. From Galatians. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. So, what's important is sharing in the faith of Abraham. And if you share in the faith of Abraham, then you become part of Abraham's people, part of Abraham's offspring and descendants. So, it's faith and peoplehood that are important. And there's only one passage where Paul refers to the land promises, and it's fascinating what he does with that passage. For the promise that Abraham would inherit the cosmos did not come to Abraham or his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Now, Paul knows better than you and I that God didn't promise Abraham the cosmos. God promised Abraham the land of Canaan. But Paul believes that through Abraham, God was beginning this grand project of saving all of humanity and, in fact, all of creation. And so, to sort of point to that, Paul paraphrases the land promise to Abraham and says that God was already promising him the whole cosmos. Um, So then, just to review, Christian Zionism claims to be so biblical, take the Bible seriously, uh, but it reads the Bible very selectively, focusing on a certain stream of Old Testament passages, and it reads the Bible as if Paul and the New Testament never happened. And what even the Old Testament, it ignores major streams of the Old Testament because the Old Testament stresses over and over again the land can be lost. But you're not guaranteed the land. If you're unfaithful, you will lose the land. And in fact, that's what happens in the story. Um, and there are these persistent passages about God. If you're going to live in God's land, you've got to do so on God's terms, and that requires justice and righteousness. Um, and you don't land grab and steal other people's lands. And so there are multiple of these kinds of passages that Christian Zionism just completely ignores because it focuses primarily on the promises of land to Abraham and Abraham's descendants, and the prophetic passages where God promises to restore the Jewish people to their homeland. And I will stop there. So, your questions, comments.
Let me just, I think absolutely, I enjoyed the way you brought out those interpretations of Paul. I put it very simply, uh, Jesus is not a Jewish nationalist.
Hmm. Hmm.
Jesus is not a military imperialist. I mean,
Right.
those two things are absolutely clear from the New Testament. Obviously, Jesus is a Jew. He spends more or less exclusively all his time amongst Jewish people, but gives indications along the way that it's going to have a universal um, opening. But I mean, the cross above all things, I mean, makes it clear that uh, he's not, as I say, a
Hmm.
Jewish nationalist. After all, he's killed by the Jewish nationalists, and he's certainly not a military imperialist. They also contributed to his death.
Hmm. Yeah, Jesus, I mean, Christians have not always realized how thoroughly Jewish Jesus is. And almost every time he opens his mouth, he's quoting or alluding to the Jewish scriptures. And yet he does not refer to the sort of nationalist texts, you know, the oh, we slaughtered the Canaanites passages. Uh, you know, we have exclusive rights to the land. He does not quote those kinds of passages. He uses the Jewish scriptures selectively because of the kind of Messiah he is. Yeah. Others.
You've talked about Christian Zionism in the US, and I'm wondering if you could say something about Christian Zionism in Canada, where sort of where Canada falls in all
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. Well, I grew up as a Christian Zionist, right? So it's in my background,
Mhm.
and I was deeply committed to this stuff earlier on in my life. So there's plenty of Christian Zionism in Canada as well. Uh, Evangelical Christianity is not as huge a force in Canada as it is south of the border. So and Yeah, evangelical Christianity carries a lot less political clout in Canada than it does in the US. And so Christian Zionism is just not nearly as big a force in Canada as it is in the US, even though the convictions of Canadian Christian Zionists would be pretty much identical to the convictions of American Christian Zionists. Yeah. But I've
And
talked to
yet,
people. Oh, go ahead, Muriel.
no, I was just going to say, and yet the government has been consistently supporting the state of Israel. We of course we don't have the capacity to send the kind of weapons or
Right.
the amount of weaponry, and but the government continues. So you're saying that it's not so much from the Christian Zionist perspective as what other reasons is it?
Yeah. I think in Canada, um, Zionism has a huge, there are huge Zionist lobby organizations in Canada. If you look at CIJA, Canadian Israel Jewish Affairs, they have huge numbers of staff. Uh,
Hmm.
and they are very, very active at lobbying federal government, individual MPs, provincial governments, um, and and uh, the Western media has projected this image of that Jews are persecuted people. Look at what happened to them in the Holocaust. And now finally they have their own nation state in Palestine, and all they want to do is live peacefully. But they are surrounded by these Arab states who are hostile to them. And there's a lot of racism in the West against Middle Eastern peoples, Palestinians, I mean, Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims. And so that all plays into it. And so I think in Canada, it's largely the narrative that Israel is this peaceful state that just wants to do its own thing. But these these Palestinians and with the support of some neighboring peoples just keep on attacking
Mhm.
Israel. And so Israel has a right to defend itself.
That
So
sounds that sounds very much like the like I heard from the Liberal MP. Who
exactly.
almost word for word. Yeah,
Right, right.
yeah,
Hamas started this, right, by attacking Israel
yeah.
on October 7th. And every nation state has the right to defend itself. And that's what Israel is doing. So that's been the liberal government line.
Mhm. Thank you. That's
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah. The Conservative Party in Canada is much more uncritical of the state of Israel and much more uncritically supportive of the state of Israel. And I think part of that may be is because Christian Zionists have a bigger impact on the Conservative Party in Canada than they do on the Liberal Party in Canada.
I have a quick question. Do you think it was wrong to set up the state of Israel since there was a lot of politics involved behind the scenes that you went into? It's very complex and interesting, but what do you think?
Uh,
Yeah.
there were Jewish people living in Palestine before the state of Israel came along. And those Jewish people lived very peacefully alongside Palestinians. So it's definitely possible for Jews, Palestinians to live peacefully side by side. Um, but it's how the state of Israel was set up that was problematic. Well, the fact that it was set up was problematic. Just like, well, you folks are from Southern Ontario mostly. Imagine if, what, large numbers of Chinese or Russians or whoever, Ukrainians, start to immigrate to Southern Ontario, and their goal is to create a Ukrainian state or a Russian state or a Chinese state in Southern Ontario. And they start dispossessing folks who are living there now. And eventually they do create a Chinese or a Russian state in Southern Ontario. Well, how's that going to go over, right? It's going to create massive resistance. And that's exactly what happened in Palestine. Interestingly, there was this one Zionist, they were versions of Jewish Zionists. Some were very militant, some were more humane towards Palestinians. And there was a debate between those different groups. There was a very militant Zionist by the name of Jeb Zabotinsky, and he scolded the moderate Zionists. He said, look at the history of colonization. He said, in every place where colonizing powers try to take the land from the indigenous people will resist because they love their land, they love their way of life, and they will defend it. So the only way that colonization can succeed is through uh, massive physical conquest. And and that's what he was arguing we Zionists need to do because it's the only way we're gonna create our Jewish state. Uh, so, but it all comes out of this European context where that kind of racism and colonialism was considered legitimate. And it just got absorbed into the DNA of Zionism and has been shaping Zionism from the very beginning. Sorry, I'm going to keep talking here a little bit um, because, in terms of the future, um, was it legitimate for the state of Israel to get established? No, I don't think so, but it has been established. And there's 7 million Jewish Israelis in Palestine. They're not going anywhere. Was it legitimate for the state of Canada to get established? No, it was not. Canada exists on stolen land, period. It was not legitimate to create the state of Canada. But Canada is a state. The 42 million or whatever settlers in Canada are not leaving. So the question for us in Canada is, given our settler colonial history and given what we have done to Indigenous peoples, how can we now move forward in a way that is just, that makes reparations, and that allows for Indigenous self-determination and moves forward in a very different way? And I think the same thing applies to Palestine. Those 7 million Jewish Israelis aren't going anywhere. The question is, what kind of justice and what kind of a state is needed so that Jews and Palestinians can live together side by side peacefully in well-being and prosperity? Yeah. Okay, Mervin, you're muted, Mervin.
Yeah, I have never voted Conservative, and I don't expect to ever vote Conservative. But I do want to draw attention to the fact that it was Diefenbaker, a Conservative leader of some note, who gave to First Nations the right to vote.
Mhm.
So that it isn't to the case that all conservatives from all through kind of Canadian history have taken this very unpassionate.
Timing and everything. Just wonderful all the way through. A nice, clear concept.
Yeah, I need to kind of add on to that, Mervyn,
Any-
as well. Professor Dan,
Mhm.
you are absolutely right. I mean, it's not how did we get here? It's where do we go from here? We need to understand and recognize the brutality of how we came to this point,
Mhm.
but how do we all exist in going forward?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's 7 million Jewish Israelis in Palestine. There's roughly 7 million Palestinians, neither of which are going anywhere. So how can these folks now live together, uh, you know, in ways that are just and peaceful? Uh, right now, things are not headed in the right direction by any stretch of the imagination in Palestine.
I think it's hard for the Palestinians because there's so many international influences at play. Whereas in Canada, we're very fortunate, right? It's between us and the Indigenous people, more or less,
Mhm.
where we can have some dialogue and make restitution. And I think it's a little bit easier, but where you have so many people with vested interests and agendas, I think it'll be a very long time. I don't know if Canada can be one of the leaders to try um, to facilitate a more dialogue and diplomacy amongst the countries, but it's going to take a long time because even the United Nations, I don't think, has the clout and the ability to to fulfill or to help them. Both sides, really.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And Canada is very gutless when it comes to Palestine, especially right now because Trump is such a total supporter of the state of Israel that and Canada, our Liberal government is paranoid about our economic trade interests, and I totally get that. And we know what happens when you poke Donald Trump. Ask Doug Ford about that. You know, so Canada is not going to poke the U.S. on Israel right about now. Yeah, Muriel.
I guess one of the things that I've come away from these talks about or with is the question of how we read the Bible
Yeah.
and how I mean I've come from a lot of those readings too,
Mhm.
but how do we now where do we look to make sure that we don't misread and that we don't keep making the same mistakes? I mean, I think I've learned a lot, but I'm sure I still keep making mistakes. I'm curious what you would have to say to that.
Oh yeah, like just to have a big dose of humility, right? I mean, it's so easy to be critical of the Christian Zionists, but a generation or two down the road, people will see how poorly we read the Bible.
Yeah.
So, a spirit of humility and always be willing to listen and learn. And I think so often the Bible has been used by the powerful to beat up on the weak.
Mhm.
And so to listen to the voices that come from the underside of history, uh, on the slavery debate, listen to what the African American slaves are saying about how to read the Bible rather than the white slave owners. Uh, on the issue, I'm an old man now, and on the issue of women in leadership in the church, listen to what women are saying. Uh, listen to what Palestinian Christians are saying. Uh, Listen to what indigenous Christians are saying about how to read the Bible in anti-colonial ways. So, yeah, that's just one among many things to say to that important question.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Well, I just want to say how much I've enjoyed these three sessions, and want to say a big thank you to all of you for being here, for your engagement, and thanks to Mervyn and Cindy for making these sessions happen. So, yeah,
Thank
blessings to
you.
all of you.
Thank you.
Thank
Fabulous,
you.
fabulous 3 weeks. Very, very well done.
Excellent.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Namaste all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Dan, for these three very informative and I think at the same time really rather sobering presentations. Certainly, presentations of history which need to, be reflected upon and internally digested, as it were, from the point of view of our own conduct in the future. I do want to just mention that Dan has made no charge for these presentations, and this is a very generous gift of his knowledge and energy and care and time, which, Dan, we all very much deeply appreciate. And I know you're going to be involved in these presentations in other contexts, and we wish you all the best in that endeavor. So these presentations have been recorded. I think we have to use the past tense now. Have been recorded. And if you apply to office at St. John's United.ca, am I right?
No, they don't even need to do that. By virtue
Don't
of the
need it?
fact that they've all registered, they just need to go back to the registration and the links will be there for the.
All right. Okay. So as simple as possible. Okay. So I know there will be people who missed one or another of the presentations, and some people Friday evening just wasn't a good evening, and they'll be very interested to be able to watch them. I'm hoping that in the new year we'll be able to participate, those of us in the Oakville area anyway, in what is called the Palestinian Land Exercise. And those of you who are living in other areas, I would recommend that you see if that can be arranged where you are. This is a very worthwhile way of involving yourself directly, as it were, into the history of the way in which the Palestinians have lost their land through war, occupation, and settlement, because you're physically involved in what is a kind of physically shrinking area of mats. And you get some kind of sense of what that means to be crowded into a smaller and smaller area. It is so impressive that we also make sure that we have people there to deal with those who feel the emotional impact of that very strongly. So I'm hoping we may be able to do that certainly in our area here, and I would again encourage others to do it where they are. So again, thanks to Cindy, who's been our technical host and fellow promoter of these presentations, and to St. John's United Church Council for endorsing their going forward. So thank you all for your attendance this evening and attendance on the other evenings also. And so I now will wish you all a very good and restful night. Thank you very much. Bye.
Good night, all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.